Good afternoon, everybody. I'm hoping that you've all managed to get online well, and we're ready to start with Falling Through the Cracks, Researching Scotland's Pioneering Mountain Women. Good afternoon. I'm delighted to be here today talking about our lovely Scotland's Pioneering Mountain Women and the process of researching them. I'm Paula Williams, and I'm Curator of Maps, Mountaineering and Polar Collections at the National Library of Scotland. My researches into these women started a few years ago when our Vets officer, Kenny, asked if I would be willing to give a public lecture on something suitable for Women's History Month. Having recently been given responsibility for our mountaineering collections at the library, I was reading various books about the history of mountaineering in Scotland, and women barely featured in any of them. I have walked and climbed, my friends walk and climb. Where were the women? And so I discovered with a bit of work that there's lots of us, lots of them, historical women for about 300 years walking in the mountains just for fun. And so the talk, Petticoats and Pinnacles, came into being, looking at the women and their writings. Last year, along came Petticoats and Pinnacles 2, the sequel, introducing some more women and their mountain adventures and writing as well. And then later this year, what began as those two lectures will be writ large in our forthcoming exhibition, Petticoats and Pinnacles, Scotland's Pioneering Mountain Women, which will open at the library on George Forth Bridge on the 29th of October. Our definitions here are quite broad. The women have to have had a link with Scotland, either living or spending time in the mountains here. Their experience of the mountains doesn't have to be achieving firsts or summiting at all, but to have considered and shared their thoughts and their experiences, describing their climbs or just being in the mountains. The exhibition will concentrate on 8 women, but mention many others, and because of the space restriction, there are many more who haven't made it in. Not because their stories aren't wonderful or fun or moving or inspirational. I was sad to cut Sheila MacDonald, for example, the first woman to reach the highest point in Kilimanjaro. After meeting a member of the Alpine Club while sailing to Africa, by the time she left the boat, she was a member of the expedition and had been given almost all the equipment that she needed by the other passengers. Achieving the summit, she drank a bottle of champagne. Dorothy Wordsworth, travelling in search of a sublime experience. Queen Victoria, riding a pony to the top of several Perthshire Munros. Maria Ogilvy Gordon, learning to rock climb in the 1880s to research the complex geological stratigraphy of the Dolomites for her doctorate dissertation. Janet Adams Smith, whose climbing runs through her life and writing like a vein of quartz. Paddy Hirst, the first woman to complete the Munros. And other Munroists like Nan Ray, who had a boyfriend who complained to her that he wished that she would look at him like she looked at that mountain. Those mountaineering books I read tend to concentrate on reaching the summits of our mountains, of men challenging and pitting themselves against nature. Even in description of the mountains before the mountaineers, the story was similar. Men crossing the mountains to attack or flee one another, surveying them to make maps, or occasionally using them as lookout points. Almost nowhere were women mentioned. Even today, if you were to look up Munros on Wikipedia, and women barely get a look in. Under notable completions, even Paddy, the first woman, doesn't get a mention. The local people who lived among the mountains and scraped a living from them appear not to exist in these books. The narratives were, and indeed still are, almost always from an outsider's view. From Kathleen Jamie. Class comes in here. For a long time, the wild land was a working place, whether you were a hunter-gatherer, a crofter, a miner. But now, it seems it's being claimed by the educated middle classes on spiritual quests. The land is empty, and the saints come marching in. I find it hard to believe that the Shealing dairymaids never explored and ranged to the top of the nearby hills. Scotland's mountains are not so high as to be forbidding on a long sunlit summer night. Catherine Stewart, from her book A Croft in the Hills, who lived among the mountains. In our own life, we had to plan for a scrap of leisure, but most often, and at any rate in summer and autumn, we would put an apple and a scone in our pockets and make off into the hills. The more closely we lived with the hills, the more compelling we found them. Away from them, we were never quite happy, and a day in town had no real charm for us. The moment of delight would come when we reached the top of the road again and saw the outline of the hills and smelt the tang of the high air. Where women are mentioned in the story of early mountaineering, they are usually only an addition and denied agency, spoken of in context of their menfolk, husbands, sons and guides. An example of a woman being denied agency would be Jane Inglis Clark. Despite founding the Ladies Scottish Climbing Club, campaigning for women to be involved in public life, becoming a Justice of the Peace and a councillor for Midlothian Council, she is best known as the mother of Charles Inglis Clark, in whose memory she and her husband William created the climbing hut on Ben Nevis. Jane was an able climber in her own right, rock climbing on Buckalette of Moor and Ben Nevis with William and their friends Harold and Ruth Rayburn. William and Harold are both remembered well as early members of the Scottish Mountaineering Club, but of Jane and Ruth there is little mention. Part of this is due to social attitudes about the abilities and roles of women in wider society, and partly because of a prevailing thought against both climbing and women climbers in particular. From 1937, Professor Innes, as reported in The Scotsman, people did not realise the tremendous physical strain of mountaineering, and many of the younger generation did not realise that to spend the week in an office and then a weekend in climbing might be a bigger strain than the human frame could endure. And Mary Mummery. The masculine mind is, with rare exceptions, imbued with the idea that a woman is not a fit comrade for steep ice or precipitous rock, and she should be satisfied with watching through a telescope some weedy and invertebrate masher being hauled up a steep peak by a couple of burly guides. You can't help thinking that poor Mary has spent too long on too many alpine terraces watching other climbers. The risks associated with mountaineering were widely discussed and reported from the beginnings of the sport. Accidents caused and still cause a huge amount of debate. Earlier this year, during Storm Ciara, the 4 trainer-wearing students rescued from Ben Nevis caused a small media storm. It's hard not to draw the conclusion that there is an element of titillation from the tone of some of the reporting, and that it is the reporting as much as the accidents themselves that forms public opinion. In this example from the Black and White magazine of 1901 on climbing the Matterhorn, the terrible accident on the Matterhorn has again called attention to the perils of mountaineering. Our artist has depicted a familiar scene on the mountain, on which Miss Mildred Bell of Hampstead and Dr. Black of Brighton met their death. It's difficult to see from the image how this is necessarily a familiar scene of people falling off. The perception of risk, however, affects how women's achievements were and are reported, not only by the external press, but also by themselves, writing for a private or a particular audience. Where male climbers were seen as heroic, pitting themselves against nature, testing their bodies, women were seen as unnatural, unmotherly, and that social horror, unladylike. And as Maria Coffey points out, when George Mallory disappeared on Everest, he too left a wife and small children behind, and yet this did nothing to dint his heroic image. Researching the mountain women has some pitfalls familiar to anyone researching historical female figures. The practice of referring to married women only by their husband's name can make it difficult to bring together all the works by one woman. I have even read one account where the female is simply referred to as Mrs. Mrs. togs up a la complete mountaineer in heavy boots and breeches, but feeding the populace slips out by a back entrance and get nearly eaten by a yard full of dogs. Mrs. who? This comes from a typewritten account of an ascent of Aconcagua by British climber Edward de la Motte and American mountaineer James Ramsay Ullman in 1928. I would guess that the missus is the author's, as he would scarcely be so rude about another man's wife. But it's still not very good that the poor woman even never gets a name. If the woman married several times, like Lizzie LeBlond, arguably the foremost female climber of her generation, the task can be even more challenging. If you're lucky, the alternatives will be brought together in a library catalogue. But this doesn't always happen, and sometimes you're left trying very hard to work out who is who. Sometimes, instead, women chose simply to write as a lady, even although their participation in outdoor pursuits apparently disqualified them from use of this epithet. You said that no woman could manage it, a certain woman climber said to a well-known mountaineer after her ascent of the peak. No, he replied. I said, no lady. Choosing anonymity meant that the women could tell their own story, but at the same time avoid disapproval and potential shame being brought upon their families. So where are the women? And they certainly weren't in the clubs and societies. Women were not allowed to join early mountaineering clubs. Again, take Jane Inglis Clark as an example. She climbed with members of the Scottish Mountaineering Club and indeed wrote articles for their journal, such as 3 on the centre grid of the Trident Buttress Ben Nevis in 1905. But her gender meant that she was unable to join. And as well as these social attitudes, there were fears as to whether a woman was physically strong enough to belay a male partner. So Jane, along with her daughter Mabel and friend Lucy Smith, set up the Ladies Scottish Climbing Club for lovers of mountain climbing in 1908. The Ladies Alpine Club had started just the year before, and the Pinnacle Club began in 1921 and concentrated more on rock climbing. Mabel went on to be president of that club too. By climbing manless, the women were able to plan and lead their own adventures. As Miriam Underhill would say, very early I realised that the person who invariably climbs behind a good leader may never really learn mountaineering at all, and in any case enjoys only part of the varied delights and rewards of climbing. I did realise that if women were really to lead, that is, to take the entire responsibility for the climb, there shouldn't be any man at all in the party. Miriam was in the first manless climb off the Grapon. But you can tell by some of the male climbers' response, that it wasn't very encouraging. Etienne Brule responded, "The Grapon has disappeared. Of course, there are still some rocks standing there, but as a climb, it no longer exists. Now that it has been done by 2 women alone, no self-respecting man can undertake it. A pity, too. It used to be a very good climb." The women who wrote about their climbing experiences were very aware of the potential disapproval of their general audience, as much from other women who didn't understand their risky behaviours, as from men who thought them unwomanly. As such, the women often downplayed the risks they were taking and sometimes emphasised the ways in which they were conforming. For example, Jane Duncan, who was the first European woman to travel through the Shangla Pass in the Ladakh Himalaya, comments on how pleasant it is not to have to dress for society while travelling, but also takes care to mention that she baths every day. By not being in the men's climbing clubs and learned societies such as the Royal Geographical Society, women rarely wrote for these journals about their climbs or expeditions. Instead, they wrote for more ephemeral magazines, and these are less likely to be collected, kept, and indexed. So where are the women? They're not in the collections. The National Library of Scotland has the largest publicly available mountaineering collection in the United Kingdom and one of the largest in the world. At the heart of this wonderful collection are the personal book collections of Thomas Graham Brown and Robert Wiley Lloyd. These special collections, with curated editions purchased through the Graham Brown Trust, are remarkably comprehensive for alpine and Himalayan climbing in the first half of the 20th century. I regularly get offered rare material by dealers, only to find that we have 3 copies of it already. In searching for works in our library catalogues, I discovered that these special mountaineering collections didn't include, for example, some works by Lizzie LeBlond, such as Mountaineering in the Land of the Midnight Sun. Lizzie was also a pioneering photographer and filmmaker, so I'm again surprised that Graham Brown, a keen photographer himself, didn't pick up her hints on snow photography. Why would these male bibliophiles not add books by women to their private collection? Was the women's climbing not of due merit? Were the books themselves not considered serious enough? Was the advertising different for women's books, so they simply weren't aware of them? Were they not available? They were made in smaller runs? Or was it simply because they were women? So I had to turn to our legal deposit collection instead. After the Copyright Act of 1710, the Advocates' Library was able to claim a copy of every book published in the United Kingdom. As you might imagine, after another 200 years, the collection was too much for the Advocates to maintain, and so the National Library came into being in 1925. This legal deposit privilege continues to this day, and the library grows by thousands of items every year. Gathered by right, rather than curated with all the inherent biases that brings, surely here I would find our women. A quick search in our catalogue sure enough revealed, here are Lizzie's books. However, some other books that I was looking for are not in our collection, specifically second editions of works like Jane Duncan's A Summer Ride Through Western Tibet or Constance Frederica Gordon's Cummings' Granite Crags, an account of her time in Yosemite. Both of these have notable changes from the first edition and would today therefore be collected by the library, as they're both Scottish authors. So why were they not? Jane's is published posthumously and includes a short memoir and a portrait, which is why I was keen to see it, having found out about the second edition from a similarly interested researcher. Constance's book has an altered title, and the second edition was issued as The Granite Crags of California, which would today alone be enough for inclusion in our collection. It's tempting to jump to the conclusion that these books were overlooked simply because they were written by women. The Advocates' Library of the period could perhaps be considered almost as a gentleman's club, and even although they were entitled to claim through legal deposit, we know that there were some categories that were not collected, not being considered relevant to their legal work, such as schools' educational texts. What other explanations are possible? I was only looking for women's writings, so this problem with second editions might be more widespread. Jane's book was issued as a cheap edition, and so maybe it was cheap editions that we didn't collect. Or the differences simply weren't recognised by staff at the time and weren't collected to save space. But whatever the historical reason, our collection is not as full as I expected it to be. There are gaps, and it's difficult to know how large they are. And it's not only our collections where gaps occur. Although Constance Gordon Cumming was one of the most exhibited artists of her day, with many watercolours on display at the Indian Colonial Exhibition, the National Galleries of Scotland do not own any of her paintings. Whether because they're watercolour or whether because they're by a woman is hard to say. We do, though, have an extensive and wonderful manuscript and archive collection at the library, so we don't have to rely purely on published and printed evidence. We hold the archives of many mountaineering women, including Nan Shepherd, Una Cameron, and Isabel Wiley Hutchison, who will feature in Petticoats and Pinnacles. And there's also Fanny Bullock Workman and Janet Adams Smith, who won't. There are also women's accounts of travels around Scotland and watercolour illustrations. However, women are in the minority still in the archives, and recent research has shown that women are more likely to offer their husbands' archives to institutions than their own. So again, the story is far from complete or even representative. And inevitably missing from the library are those who did not record their adventures at all, whether by choice or by lack of education or opportunity. And just because there's no written record doesn't mean it didn't happen. And so we're back again to our shieling dairymaids. The written and published accounts we have in our collection are from European middle or upper class perspective. The stories are by people who visit the mountains, searching for an experience. Of course, there were people living among the mountains, and they leave little or no voice behind. Indeed, they're the original mountaineers. That's what mountaineers meant, people who lived there, among the mountains. The echoes from these mountaineers are to be found amidst other people's writing, but rarely their own. Remember that girls had no access to regular education until the 20th century. Even in the 1750s, when 65% of men could at least sign their name, only 15% of women of all social ranks could do the same. So who would record their thoughts and feelings and lives? Generations of voices have been lost to our nation's history and culture. I said in my blurb for this talk that I would look at the delights of researching these women. The delight has been in meeting them through their writing. They have achieved genuinely amazing things, usually with grace and humility. I've been struck by the similarities between them. Take Jane Inglis Clark again, from her book Pictures and Memories in 1908. No one has really seen the mountains who has not seen them under all their conditions, in storm, rain and wind, as well as in stillness and sunshine. A day on the mountains in bad weather will teach you more of your own frailties and those of your friend than a month of holiday by the seaside. And then 100 years later, from Jaquetta Megary in Explore Mount Kilimanjaro. Reaching the summit is not the only goal. Success lies rather in the quality of the attempt. Living a lot closer to nature than you're used to, you will explore your own motivation and recognize your dependency on others. On return from Kilimanjaro, whether you succeed or not, you will know more about yourself, your strengths and weaknesses, and your fellow humans than when you set out. They speak about appreciation and friendship and taking the time to enjoy it while you're there, not simply to race through it just to say you've been. Their message is almost invariably to enjoy the mountains. I hope you've enjoyed this brief run through our background to researching petticoats and pinnacles and how our ladies have been lost. If you're interested in finding out more, please go to our website, to our Aiming High learning resource, which has been up now for a few years and started after the original Petticoats and Pinnacles lectures, and we'll be adding to this as we prepare for the exhibition later this year. Thank you very much.
Paula, thank you so much for such an interesting and engaging talk as always. The Q&A session is now started, so you can type in your questions. I'm joined by my colleague Jo, who I think may have, hopefully, the first question available. Over to you, Jo.
Do indeed. Thanks very much, Paula. That was really interesting as always. So this first question comes from Leslie. Leslie has asked, even in the 1990s, the assumption was that anyone doing winter climbing in Scotland was male. Admittedly, we all look much the same because of the clothes. I hope women climbers are a bit more visible now. Is this the case?
I think because of the interest that has come around talks like this and running up to the exhibition, then I think that women climbers in general are much more visible than they used to be. There's a large groundswell of people who are interested in women being in the mountains. That doesn't mean that everybody is climbing. We're not all doing really hard mountaineering, certainly not necessarily snow and ice climbing, but I think there's much more awareness that women can do this stuff too, which sounds so obvious, but doesn't seem to have been in the past.
Next question is from Deb Carr. Deb, thanks for joining us this evening. From your research, which lady, and which lady, and I know this is going to be difficult because we've discussed this so many times, which lady do you most admire and why?
Oh, that's so hard. You'll gather from the talk today that I've got a bit of a soft spot for Jane Inglis Clark. I think she was a remarkable and redoubtable woman, and I think she's remarkably modern for somebody who lived 100 years ago. I think her climbing ability and her awareness of her own position and ability to change things, and it's one of the things that's sort of strand that we've unfortunately not had really time to look at, is how quite a lot of these women were involved in women's suffrage, in improving women's education, and in her case about women in public life. So I really like Jane, but I also really like the other Jane E. Duncan, who went through the Shangla Pass, and I mentioned her briefly too. I really enjoyed her book, and I think it's a real shame that she died on her way home from subsequent travels and never got to publish another one. But one of the things that I like about her is that she was an older lady. Well, a few of them were kind of older ladies when they set off on these major world travels. So she was well into her 50s. She went when her dad died, and suddenly she's kind of free, if you like, from family ties. But I think she's been a little bit of a secret rebel, and I quite like that about her. And I like the whole stuff about she sort of makes out that she's slumming it in this tent on the way through the Himalaya, but actually she's got this lovely felted carpet, and she's got really nice soft local leather boots, and she eats really well. And there's a lovely account of her eating a scone while carrying her parasol on some treacherous cliff path, riding this obstreperous pony. And I just like her kind of her view on things is quite interesting, as this kind of nice middle class Glaswegian lady. She's great.
Brilliant. Not your typical camping trip then.
Nope.
So our next question actually kind of follows on from something you touched on there. It's from Lorna. Do you know of any women climbers in the early 20th century who were active suffragettes or suffrage supporters? So I don't know if you can go into that a little bit more.
Yes, famously we have the picture of Fanny Bullock Workman holding the Votes for Women newspaper on a glacier in the middle of the Himalayas. She was very firmly making her point. I have to say she's also a bit of a favourite. Unfortunately hasn't made it into Petticoats and Pinnacles because of her lack of Scottish credentials, but we are lucky in holding her archive. So she's the most sort of obvious, but quite a lot of them, as I say, seem to have been involved in one way or another and the very fact actually that they were climbing and being seen to climb in some ways were pushing those boundaries.
Amazing.
Okay, Paul, I'll go on to a question from Julie Gibb. Julie has asked, are you collecting current accounts of women climbers, walkers?
Yes, we do. We have some very modern women in our archive collection, particularly ladies like or women like Myrtle Simpson. So we are still collecting and will continue to do so, which is great, very exciting.
Fab. I'm not sure. Oh, Kenny's back. There we go. So the next question.
I'm having a little glass of water, so forgive me.
Next question is from Merrin. So she says that many women are getting up into the mountains, but are they getting a representative share of publication opportunities now?
Oh, that's a good question. Actually, I don't know. I have to admit at this point that my research is stopped around about the 1950s. So I haven't looked more recently. I know there are, having said that, I know that there are some very good recent publications about women writing about mountains and creative responses to being in the mountains. But I still suspect that there aren't as many women as men writing for the clubs and club journals, even although women are now admitted into most of them. So yeah, it's a really interesting point. I'll need to go and look it up now.
Future project.
Yeah.
I realise we're throwing all these questions at you, so forgive us.
Keep going.
Okay.
I'll say if I can't answer them.
This is from Anonymous. how did the Victorian women manage to climb in those skirts? And when were women allowed to wear trousers?
Oh, I love this question. This is great. They didn't. Fundamentally, there's all these fantastic pictures, and I showed some of them today of women crossing the Mer de Glace, particularly in Chamonix. They were tourists. They weren't actual climbers. Now, obviously, they were still doing something that was fairly dangerous, but most of them had 2 guides each to kind of carry them across things. So in some ways, they're slightly spurious images. And most of the women who were doing genuine climbing would remove their skirts when out of public view and wear some kind of breeches. Prior to that, they would wear shortened skirts, which probably came to just about below the knee, and then have kind of wide bloomer type ankle length trousers, as we would call them now, underneath. And the second part of that was about when trousers became acceptable. And I think it depends on where you were. Obviously, after sort of land girls, the influence of the 2 world wars, by the time you get into the 1950s, it's certainly acceptable to wear trousers. But that mid-war period is a bit harder. If you were living, so Nan Shepherd, for example, who lived on Deeside and famously did all her walking in the, well, lots of walking in the Cairngorms, didn't wear trousers. And I was talking to somebody about this just the other week, and we were saying that Aberdeenshire is a very small c conservative area, and I think it would have been quite scandalous for her to wear trousers even up into that kind of later period. I know of accounts of women climbers who have on a Sunday left their house dressed in their Sunday best as if they were going to church, and then once they're out of the village, pull their trousers on and leave the skirt somewhere so they can go off and do it. So I think fairly probably up to about the middle of the 20th century, it wasn't acceptable in some parts of the UK, certainly.
I love that. Love that idea. Joe, over to you.
Grand. So our next question is from Simone. So Simone has asked, do any of your women write about motherhood and mountaineering? Just wondered if you could get a sense of the entanglements in everyday life in their writing.
The best examples of that I've come across were actually Myrtle Simpson. In her books, she writes a few books for children, but she writes about taking her family on these largely actually polar expeditions and sometimes climbing with them. She takes her older children up mountains, and there's lovely accounts of her trying to get back from Greenland. They have a very hasty kind of flight back, and they didn't really have time to pack, and she's sort of got one slightly smelly baby under one arm and trying to shoo all the kids along, and they've got a pan with burnt on porridge or something that actually makes it all the way back to the UK, and the poor customs officers are kind of going, what's this? and she's very honest about how she kind of deals with it. I have to say she sounds wonderful, how she kind of juggles it all, but I think she's the most honest one that I've read so far about how difficult it is actually to do all those things at once. And then she also talks about leaving the children when she goes off to go and do an expedition, and how difficult it is that they're in tears and she's in tears, and the older ones are going, oh, I always knew you'd come back, which just must be heartbreaking in itself. It's such a difficult thing. So yeah, I think Myrtle's the best that I've read so far.
Sounds like super mum.
Yeah, absolutely.
Kenny?
The next one is, it just shows the power of Zoom and the National Library's webinars. We've got hello from Chicago. I can almost hello back, Chicago. Chicago is asking, are the books which you quoted from currently in print?
Oh, I don't know off the top of my head, I have to say. It's one of the wonders of working at the National Library, is that we have such a lot of stuff at our fingertips. And I should say that all of this is available freely for everybody who's here to use. So lovely Chicago, next time you're over, come and see us. But some of them have been reprinted, but quite a lot of them probably haven't. So things like Pictures and Memories, Jane Inglis Clark one was actually privately published just for her family. So it's become quite rare. Sorry.
Not at all. Joe.
Yeah, so this one's from Anonymous. It's quite interesting. It touches upon our last event, actually. So there's a nice crossover there. So this person has asked, is there any mention of menstruation and mountaineering, or was that too taboo?
Hardly any. And we've kind of been looking, as we've been having this conversation in the library about menstruation. And I was intrigued. Again, people like Jane who go off traveling later in life, we were wondering if that was one of the reasons why they left it to that point to go. It would just be so much easier without having to have the whole sort of embarrassment of having to, as it would have been at the time, of having to wash your rags and all that kind of stuff, and just how you dealt with that while traveling on a mule. But no, they tend not to mention it, that I've found so far. But it would have been such a taboo subject that even although they were quite brave about doing other things, I think that would maybe have been a step too far.
Thanks, Paul. Alien Ogilvy is asking the question, I don't know, again, we're just putting these to you. So have you come across any Gaelic-speaking women climbers in your research?
Good question. Surprisingly few. And I'm sure that's not because they're not there. It's partly because I don't have Gaelic, which would make it hard for me to, but no, not specifically. I know of a few Gaelic poets who have written about being in the mountains, and I'm therefore tempted to assume that they've been at least hill walking, but I don't actually know. If you know of any, let me know. I'd love to be able to add that into the story.
Absolutely. If anybody's out there that's got something that they'd like to send in, please send it to us. We're always wanting to learn more and more. Joe, over to you.
Yeah, lovely. So we've got an anonymous question here. How were the women treated when they returned to society after going on these expeditions?
Oh, that's a very good question. Most of my research probably hasn't actually covered that. I think they would be viewed as oddities, that they would have great stories to tell, and some people, in the same way as friends coming home from holiday now, some people were fascinated by it and other people probably aren't. I think there was a sense that they didn't necessarily understand what they'd been doing. And maybe it depended slightly on how the women themselves had reported that. So that whole thing that I mentioned in the talk about how they tread a very fine line between sort of excitement and trying to conform at the same time. For quite a lot of them, I think it must have been very difficult coming home. So people like Isabella Bird always felt much worse when she was in Edinburgh than she did in any other part of the world. So for somebody who, while she was here, would sort of languish on a sofa being ill, could then go off and ride a stallion across Morocco or whatever it happened to be. That must have been quite difficult for her family, I think, as well, or friends, to kind of understand those differences. I think it must have been difficult.
Yeah, absolutely.
Paula, this is one from Alexa Kelly. She is a little bit into your research. You mentioned that certain accounts of women mentioned by simply Mrs. When that happened, how do you go about trying to piece together who was who?
Luckily, because of the age of the stuff that I largely am looking at for this, quite a lot of people have already done all the work. So there's a climber called Nia Moran who has very helpfully pieced together, she's got a little table in one of her books about various women climbers' married names, so you can start to kind of pass them back. I'm guessing in her case, because lots of them were friends or actually relatives, she seems to be connected to half the climbing people in Europe, so that kind of thing's quite useful as a start. Otherwise, things like the little example that I gave, I can only guess. I don't think there's any way to really work it out, and apart from finding other accounts of the same expedition and seeing if any of them are any more explicit, which I haven't yet done for that one.
Jill, we've still got time for a couple more.
Sure, absolutely. So this is a really interesting question, and it might actually, you mentioned earlier that your work is more up to the 1950s, so it may be that you haven't covered this yet, but interesting question regardless. Is there any information on how or if diversity is being increased further in outdoors? It still feels like a very white, middle class, upper class community, and I feel like we still have a long way to go. It'd be amazing to learn about some even more varied perspectives, both historic and current. So have you come across any diverse figures?
No. Okay. But I do know that there's a very recently set up, trying desperately to remember what it was called, Black Geographers, I think it's Black Geographers, who are looking at exactly this issue about diversity into the outdoors. They were looking at geography in the widest sense, not just as the academic kind of subject. And I think there must be people out there who are doing it, but they're not necessarily communicating it back to us. And it's partly that thing about where do you publish, where do you write, and you don't need to publish or write. You could just be out there having a nice time, and that's perfectly enough for them. And so it's it's a difficult subject, and I think there are moves towards making things more inclusive, but we're not there yet.
Thank you.
Well, we've got a question now from Gareth, and Gareth's asking, were any of these incredible women also involved in other adventurous pursuits, perhaps flying or other things that were considered male only?
Jane was, I believe, among the first women in Edinburgh to go bicycling, which, bearing in mind what they wore at the time, is probably more dangerous than it first sounds. As I say, Isabella did sort of long distance lone riding and rode the stallion across Morocco, as well as riding when she was in the Rocky Mountains. When she was in the Rockies in Colorado, she went off for several days on her own in really deep snow. Sheila, I think, did flying, if I remember rightly, as well. So yes, there are a few of them who definitely indulged in all sorts of risky sports.
Great. We've got time for one last question. Jo, I'll let you ask the last question.
Sure thing. So, Victorian travellers often gave public lectures about their travels. Did any women do the same?
Yes. Isabella Bird became the first woman member or fellow of the Royal Geographical Society, so she lectured to them. And Fanny Bullock Workman gave lectures, I think, quite regularly as part of their fundraising for their next expedition. She travelled largely with her husband, and they would give sort of lantern slide lectures about their previous adventures to fundraise towards their next ones and to promote their book. So they wrote a book about each expedition as well. And we have some of Fanny's picture slides in the collection.
Wow. That's pretty cool.
Fantastic. And I have to bring this evening's webinar to a close. Can I just thank you, Paula, for just a brilliant evening. I've so enjoyed it. I hope everybody out there has enjoyed it as much as I have. Can I remind you that Jo and myself are back on Thursday this week at 5 p.m. That's British summertime, when we are joined by another of our curators, Anne Cameron, from our Moving Image Archive department. Anne will be here to give a talk called Wild Scotland on Film. This webinar is part of our nature series. Jo and myself had a sneaky preview this morning of some of the clips which will be shown on Thursday. And I really think it promises to be another great webinar. So try and join us for that. Finally, as always, on behalf of the National Library of Scotland, thank you everyone who has joined us this evening. We had some 500 bookings for the event, so we really appreciate your virtual support from all over the world. Stay safe, be kind to yourself, and bye for now.